Hello, I'm Jo Coburn, and we are live from High House in London for Project Syndicate. Welcome to London Climate Action Week 2025. And indeed, welcome to the biggest ever London Climate Action Week. Despite, or perhaps because of the current geopolitical situation, this year's event has more than doubled in size, with 100,000 people expected to take part in over 700 events across the week, here in the UK capital. And we like to think you've chosen the pick of the bunch here with Project Syndicate. Over the next 2 hours, we'll be hearing from, amongst others, Adair Turner, member of the House of Lords and chair of the Energy Transitions Commission. We're also joined by Executive Vice President of Cascale, Andrew Martin. Jean-Kiel Hackenberg, CEO of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. Jonathan Hall is Managing Partner of the Sustainable Transformation Practice at Kantar. And by Priti Srivastava, Group Head of Sustainability at Asahi. And just a quick reminder before we start, we'd love you to join in the conversation too, so please do get involved using the hashtag #PSEvents. Now, it's time to begin our first session of the day, maintaining the momentum, because while the wind has been in the sails or turbines of the climate change transition for the best part of 2 decades now, it's fair to say the last couple of years has seen it buffeted by multiple headwinds. Let's take a closer look at the state of play.
Tesla has become the world's most valuable automaker, with a market capitalization of more than $1 trillion. It's redefined the EV market.
Solar panels have become so cheap, they're being used to make garden fences in places like Germany and the Netherlands.
Clean energy stocks are off to a very strong start.
That's right, clean energy coming off a record 2020, and that momentum showing no signs of slowing down.
The inflation crisis was caused by massive overspending and escalating energy prices, and that is why today I will also declare a national energy emergency. We will drill, baby, drill.
The next item here is the withdrawal from the Paris Climate Treaty.
BP has slashed planned investment in renewable energy and said it would increase annual oil and gas spending.
Now, it's a huge pleasure to introduce our first panel. Jonathan Hall, Managing Partner of the Sustainable Transformation Practice at Kantar. Group Head of Sustainability at Asahi, Priti Srivastava. Jean-Kiel Hackenberg is CEO of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, and Erinch Sahan, Business and Enterprise Lead at Donut Economics Action Lab. Welcome to all of you. Perhaps a round of applause for our panelists. And just a quick reminder before we start, we'd love you to join in the conversation too, so please do get involved using the hashtag PS Events. But let's start, and can I start with you, Jean Kiel? If we just take a pause and look at the moment that we are currently in, it's a very important, critical moment. The world's largest emitter is pulling out of the Paris Agreement, as we were reminded of. Companies are rolling back on ESG. How dangerous or not, in your mind, is this moment in the summer of 2025?
So we're definitely seeing a rollback in ESG in terms of commitments, but really interestingly, the work we're doing, we're seeing companies lean into specific things, and because they want to move away from just commitments and be able to point to action and scale up. And so we're very much seeing the opposite of that, which is quite exciting. That's notwithstanding the need to, we need to still focus on policy and enabling conditions to make it happen.
Right, are you seeing the same sort of thing, Pretty, in your mind? I mean, as a huge multinational, Asahi, does it feel different operating today than it did 12 months ago?
It does, but I come from the world of sustainability, and we've been in an uphill battle for 2 decades already. So it doesn't feel very different, honestly. I feel like the weight hasn't become lighter, but our backs have become stronger. And I think it's a little bit polarizing because, as you said, it's the largest emitter that has stepped away, but there are still 195 countries in the game, still part of the Paris Agreement. There are more than 10,000 companies, along with ours, who are still part of the science-based targets, 1.5 ambition. So I think Oceans Pact happened last week. There is so much of positive work happening still. So I'm an eternal optimist. So I see this as a point of, this has happened before. Honestly, this has actually happened before a few years ago when the country stepped away from the Paris Agreement. But it didn't slow us down, and I don't think it will slow us down either.
I mean, it's interesting to hear because in some ways it goes against the assumed grain, if you like, because of political changes, particularly in the United States when it comes to leadership. Is your experience the same as our other panelists when it comes to this issue? Is it partly because it's been so embedded now?
Well, what I've noticed is that for a long time there was progress made because there was an assumption that governments were going to act hard and decisively, and now that assumption's been cracked a little bit. So people got wobbly, they got weak knees as a result of governments now not looking as bold, not looking as ambitious on a number of fronts, and the voluntary stuff, some of it has slowed, and it actually has exposed the more deep structural change that we need to make within companies and within financial markets. That the kind of corporates, the kind of financial systems we designed for the 20th century are no longer going to deliver the solutions to 21st century challenges. So for me, it's really put a bit of a magnifying glass over the depth of the transformation that's actually needed, and maybe let us get over some of the less realistic expectations we had from 20th century structures.
Right, but do you not need strong political leadership still in this sphere, Jonathan, to really push forward the targets?
Nothing you do. I think what just to reiterate though, I think we are clearly living in a period of uncertainty where political leadership is needed. However, we shouldn't forget, if we step back and put it in the broader context, that actually we've been living in an era of disruption now for a long time. Yeah. Since the financial crisis in 2008, actually. The period before that was actually the unusual thing, what economists call great moderation. I think now, what the challenge that politicians and businesses are having to get used to is adapting processes which were invented before that period of disruption. And in the meantime, signal to various administrations that actually, they're doing certain things. Nevertheless, the business of actually getting on with a highly disrupted world that's going to only become increasingly disrupted thanks to climate change. So that's the sort of challenge I think businesses are facing right now.
Right, well, despite what all of you have said, some of the stats are perhaps dispiriting, despite being the eternal optimist, as you were saying, Pretty. Let me just show you this, Jonathan. I'll get you to comment first of all. It's a chart from Morningstar. You can see there it shows asset managers rebranding ahead of new UK and EU anti-greenwashing rules, with the majority, as you can see, changing or even dropping ESG terms altogether. What do you make of that?
I mean, I think it's quite timely, actually, because I think there's a maturity with regard to ESG and DEI. I think previously we, as a community and more broadly, people were talking about morality as the basis for the conversation, the basis for making a business case, making a political case to citizens, consumers, and the investment community. Now what we're seeing, I think, is a shift from morality to materiality. And I think that's a critical and important shift. And you'll see, for example, the investment funds, there's been an emphasis on net zero specifically. We'll see much more of an emphasis on resilience. I think it's $24 trillion now, looking at incorporating nature-related risk into the management of those assets.
Jean-Pierre, what do you make of the graph?
So I would agree with you, actually. So what we're seeing is that perhaps all been leading with the wrong language.
Yeah.
And we need to really be focusing on the economic case, the market opportunity, which is then driving everything that we all care about. So when we're worried about not having money in our pockets and that kind of crisis, we need to lean into the language that everybody understands. And by doing that, we can still address ESG concerns. We're just leading with different language.
Right, but that language is interesting, and the conversation you have to have with the public. Do you think the public is convinced of the costs and the benefits, if you like, of investment being spent in this area?
Can I comment on this
Of
one
course.
as well? If you really unpack the numbers, I'm glad that ESG terms are being dropped, because these are the ones that led to the greenwashing. If you're not credible, if you don't have the data and science to back it up, you might as well drop it. So I think there is a context to the numbers as well as you look at it. And speaking to consumers, to the question that you were asking, Joe, I think it's important to contextualize, as you were saying. Don't do it because it's good for the planet, right? We have to create stories that are intellectually and emotionally stimulating when we speak about sustainability. So is it about, as a company, for example, as Asahi, if we are focused on return of investments, then we're looking at short and long-term investments of sustainability. If you're looking at profits, how are you calculating the profit? Have you factored the carbon price in? If you're looking at business continuity, are you looking at your scarcity of supply chain? So you have to contextualize, and that's when you will see the real value that sustainability is bringing.
Because this term green hushing, Eric, was touched on by businesses where the ESG work is actually still going on under the bonnet. How real is that when we're talking about language, and how much of a problem is it?
I mean, I think, Joe, it is real. It is. We are seeing companies being a lot more careful with how they talk about what they're doing and what they're committing to. And I think my fellow panelists are right that actually we've separated the wheat from the chaff here. The ones that are now talking about it are the ones that are emboldened enough, confident enough, and committed enough to go the full hog. The problem is there aren't enough of these. We need to expand this pool, and we need to rapidly transform the broader economy as well.
Right, and when you talk about the numbers, what are you talking about in percentage divide then?
I mean, I don't have a specific figure, but the majority of companies that I was noticing speaking about being good for people and planet in very vague terms, I think are now being much more careful. You're looking up on their websites, you're not seeing, careless, vague claims about what they're doing, or nicely wordsmithed purpose statements that, 20 years ago I worked at Procter & Gamble and we had on our lanyards, touching life, improving lives. We tried to sell more shampoo. That was the job. And yes, it touches lives and it's a product that can improve your life in some way. But wordsmithing the core purpose of profit maximization, I think that's the bit that we're starting to see companies move away from. That's a good thing. But it's also exposing that the kind of things that need to happen are not happening at scale.
I think we need to recognise that as businesses and as politicians, we've failed with regard to our communications on sustainability issues. We're doing extremely poorly. I think if you look at some research that we did last year, 83% of brands have a net negative rating from a consumer perspective, and 59% of people say that they've experienced globally greenwashing claims, greenwashing from businesses. So I think the way consumers and citizens view these issues is extremely negatively right now. And green hushing has its roots in these concerns around greenwashing. So it's very tempting for a business, for example, to start rolling back on these issues and being quiet. But actually our latest data from the United States 2 weeks ago shows that actually people want to hear from companies, that actually the demand for businesses to take more of a stance and communicate clearly is on the rise.
Well, and that feeds into research done by Kantar showing 2/3 of survey respondents from around the world consider it the responsibility of corporations to solve climate and environmental issues, not just politicians in this case. So businesses are slowing on ESG, although I take what all of you have said, maybe they're saying less about it but doing more. But if that is the case because of the political environment, is there a risk that Asahi is going to disappoint its customers?
Always. That risk is always there. But I don't think, if you miss the bus running. So I don't think just because of what is happening externally in the world, it gives an excuse for an organization to take a step back. It does make us more vigilant, makes us focus more on our data, on our science, on our targets, on sharing our roadmaps. Jonathan was talking about brands. We have 22 brands. And we've realized that not every single brand should stand for sustainability. It needs to be inherent in the DNA, in the legacy of the brand. What works in Italy doesn't work in India. So there is a lot of unpacking of how to connect with the consumer on sustainability with brands. And it has to be done in a structured way. Can't be we are doing good for the world in one go.
Well, let's talk about the return. Jean-Kiel, you mentioned it, and I'm going to show everybody this graphic. $12 trillion is the number from the Sustainable Development Commission and McKinsey that's been put on the business opportunity of the transition to net zero. We see numbers like this, they're big numbers, but clearly not all businesses see the transition just in positive terms. They see it as a cost, but maybe not so much the benefit. What's the reason for that disconnect?
So I think that the challenge is when you're looking at scaling things, you only get the benefit of the economics if you're really doing it in collaboration with others. So this backlash on ESG reporting is having the opposite effect for those brands that are really committed and those organisations to figure out how to collaborate together so there's less overlap in order to scale solutions, which then starts to deliver opportunity and a better economic business case.
But what sort of timescale are we talking about? Is it because businesses just see it as too long-term for the initial investment that's needed before scaling up?
Well, you see you see IKEA, they've committed to circularity by 100% circularity by 2030. Nestle have committed to 50% of their revenues from regenerative agriculture by 2030. That's 1.5% of the world's food industry, right? Which is huge. So whilst we see this backlash, we're also seeing deeply committed organisations that are figuring out, packaging in plastics needs to be a collaborative effort that's both global rules from a political play, but also from a voluntary perspective. So how can you double down on reuse, on infrastructure and alternatives to single-use plastics as one example. So that's what we're seeing.
Erin?
I'm going to slightly be controversial here and say I think we are losing time by pretending like there's a business case for all the transitions and transformations that are needed, by pretending like all the fruit that needs to be picked is low-hanging fruit, and then I think a lot of the low-hanging fruit got picked. There's a few left, but talking about just the low-hanging fruit makes it then harder for us to build the ladders for the high-hanging fruit. And those ladders are going to require us to change ownership models. The way we have publicly listed companies being demanded to have quarterly returns growth, the way private equity demands certain conditions, the way venture capital is shaping startups and morphing startups into one particular kind of corporate model is severely limiting possibility. So our enthusiasm for the win-wins is undermining the deeper change that's needed in the corporate world and the investment world. And I think that's kind of the crux we're at now. Are we going to get real as we see numbers like this and go, well, they're not happening. People aren't stupid at business. They're good at business. They know their own self-interest. And they're deciding against it. They're deciding to keep the status quo, keep their business models, some exceptions aside, and we're going to have bigger, deeper change.
Well, that's a very candid response to perhaps what's happening. Is it one that you share?
It is. I mean, I think the way that many corporations are framing this in terms of short versus long term, I think we were talking about
I feel like ganged up here.
Short versus long term, I think, is a misnomer, because I think what it does, to Amish's point, is it makes you think in terms of, well, we need to invest over the long term, but actually, we can't really deliver in the short term. Actually, I think the magic formula is understanding that sustainability and the economic conditions act as a fruitful constraint for innovation. And that then implies that innovation will come from product, service, business model and system level, which will in turn bring growth to those organisations.
But does there need to be a bit more honesty that not everything can turn a profit? If you take what Erin was saying, you're at the consumer coalface in a corporation, a massive corporation. It can't all be a return.
There has to be a level of honesty and there has to be a level of risk-taking required, right? So I'll give you an example. There's an EBITDA. All of us know how we calculate our profits. With that model in mind, none of my investments are going to cut it at all. None of them.
None of them.
And so we said, let's look at the equation. Let's look at how we're calculating a profit. If you deduct the cost of carbon from that profit, we call it S-EBITDA, then you actually start seeing the returns because you're factoring in the price of carbon. We do that for every single investment that we make, and that creates a clear business case. Not every company does it. It was an uphill battle for us as well, but we are there now. And when we speak about innovation, and we saw that $1 trillion number on the screen, that again requires a little bit of a structured thinking. So, and sometimes serendipity helps. As a corporation, we invested in, I'll give you a concrete example. We want to reduce our carbon footprint, so we created a vending machine that captures carbon. We are not a vending machine manufacturer. We make food and beverages. But we created that vending machine as part of our innovation project. It worked well, and we said, oh, this is an additional revenue stream for us. We can actually use this as another portfolio. And then we realized that the waste from the vending machine is a concrete that goes into another sector. That's another additional revenue stream. And now we are actually finding that it's a hub for coral agriculture. So we're sending it to the seas. So I'm just saying you can't be scared of the uncertainty and hold back. You have to give it a shot. And for more times than often, you will see the return on investment if you're calculating it well.
But is that easier for much bigger corporations and companies? How big do you have to be to take that risk, to take that shot, without losing enough money from your business that actually it becomes a disadvantage?
I guess my observation would be that, yes, of course, if you're a large corporation, you have the ability to see the economic dependency upon nature and therefore try and plan for it. I think the challenge there is that businesses are not doing well enough in the communication to their consumers and how sustainability should be calibrated within their propositions. I think actually large corporations look at smaller organisations sometimes with envy because they think, well, they're born good, they've been designed around sustainability principles. Right?
Let me just show everyone this quote from the COP30 president, designate Andre Correa de Largo. If you read that quote, there is a migration from scientific denial to a denial that economic measures against climate change can be good for the economy and the people. Jean-Gilles, do you think denial is the right word here? How much of a problem is it?
So, going back to this whole language that we were talking about earlier, right? I think what we've got to talk about is people, because ultimately people care about people, whether it's about themselves or their communities or their country, whatever it might be. And we've been leading everything around this, around the planet. And the planet is disassociated from our personal lives. So by changing it into a socio-economic consideration and opportunity, how are we taking that into consideration? I think that then starts to lead into different economic measures that we need to put in place.
I think we need to ask some questions that don't get asked in boardrooms, such as, what do you need to stop doing that won't belong in the economy of the future? What do you need to discontinue? Not how do we make it less unsustainable, but how do we actually, what do we move into? What does the future look like for our business, for our sector? And that means very painful choices, But instead, I think we're stuck in a model of going, what we are today, how do we make it less unsustainable? And that answer is forcing us to lose a lot of time.
Painful choices. Can you give an example of what you might stop doing? I know in politics, no one can ever tell me what we should stop doing, but they want a smaller state quite often, because that's a difficult message to sell to people.
Yeah, I mean, I would start with, for instance, if we're looking at fashion, well, fast fashion is inherently not sustainable. We need to move away. But all the effort is how do we retain fast fashion and make it a bit less unsustainable. Agriculture, the same. Monocrop, high-intensive input agriculture. The same with the urban environment and reusing all, existing buildings to an extent. The same with making sure that we move away from products that are, creating dependency, creating health problems. What we're in the business of is reducing harm. And I think we need the courage and the financial independence in companies to reinvent themselves rather than just make tweaks along the edges.
So telling consumers what they should do to some extent, or is that seen as too much interference?
I would argue that it's giving the opportunity to consumers how they put in front of mind circularity, for example. I feel like I should probably say that. But taking the fashion example, so how do you still make money in fashion without selling more clothes? So rent, repair, recycle. If you think about Vinted, if you think about Veja, if you think about Decathlon, they allow repair and you can take them in store. These are models that need to be put front of mind so consumers don't think new is best.
Other examples in other industries and sectors, things you might stop doing, as you mentioned, agriculture?
I mean, one thing I would say is that I think implicit in that statement that we had up a second ago is the fact that it's going to be against citizens and consumer interests to make the transition. And I think that, again, is a false assumption. Because actually, when you look at Kantar's most recent Sustainability Sector Index data, 85% of people globally want to live more sustainable lifestyles, but only 29% feel they can follow through on it. Now, some people say, oh, that's just overclaim or whatever, and there will no doubt be some of that. But the fact is, people experience very real barriers as citizens and consumers, and they're looking for help from businesses and from politicians to help bring down those barriers. And I think that's a critical point.
Priti, when it comes to being a sustainability lead of a corporate, is it a problem, or is it changing, that sometimes these issues are siloed off, to use that word, into one department rather than being spread across the whole company?
You read my mind. Because when you were talking about 20th century versus 21st, the way our organizations have been designed, we still have a CFO and a CMO and a CSO. And I think if we still keep operating in those models, it's not going to work for the 21st century and the problem we're talking about. And therefore, before we did any of the work on sustainability, the first thing we did was just integrate it horizontally across everybody, the entire leadership. It's not just my job to reduce CO2, and even better, connect it to their performance incentives, right? So the targets for the CO2 reduction are connected to the bonuses, not just for me, but for Chief Marketing Officer and for our Chief Executive Officer.
And have they achieved them? I mean, are they on target to achieve those sort of incentives?
We'll see in 3 years.
Do you agree with that, spreading it across horizontally, not just making it the job or the duty of one particular department? Or do people step back if they haven't got somebody literally overseeing it from above?
I think at a management level, I completely agree with Preeti. We do need to completely rejig it, but we need to go one level up. Who is the company in service to? Currently, we've designed companies to be in service to finance, and finance is in service to itself. It's in the service of maximum extraction, maximum accumulation, and that is hardwired into boards. So we're starting to see innovations in this. Companies like Faith in Nature saying, let's have nature on the board by having the organization Lawyers for Nature. Companies like Patagonia saying, Earth is now our only shareholder. They've deployed something called steward ownership, where their shares, the controlling shares, with a purpose-led trust, and their dividend-bearing shares are going to an ecological NGO. So we're starting to see these innovations like employee ownership models and hybrids of employee ownership, like Lush, for instance, is moving to a hybrid model. All of these are changing the governance structure, which is actually leading to managerial restructuring and unlocking huge levels of ambition.
Right, well that's interesting because it leads into my question to you, Jean-Kiel, which is the World Economic Forum's annual Global Risk Report put extreme weather events second only to armed conflict as the greatest perceived risk in 2025. Do you think businesses, following on from what we've just heard from Erin, could and should attribute the same importance to it?
Well, absolutely. And I think this goes down to risk to supply. It's just another category of risk of supply, whether it's because of weather, because of armed conflict, because of cost, because of material security. All of that is risk to supply to serve your business. So thinking with circularity in mind, with sustainability or climate in mind, needs to be reframed under the banner of risk to supply. Then you start to see action.
Well, let's just take a look at this clip, and Priti, I'll get you to respond first of all to it.
Everything I got as a sustainability UPC creator last week, but instead of the normal unboxing, let's talk about the cool initiatives behind all of these sustainable brands. Starting with the Earthling Co., they're a plastic-free brand that just released their new fall scent vanilla chai in their shampoo bars, a great sustainable hair care swap. Next, the Great Wrap just launched in the US, and they created a compostable food wrap made out of food waste. It'll break down in 180 days. It's so cool. It's a refill model, and the case is so cool. We love to see this type of innovation in the industry as we focus on alternatives to petroleum-based plastics.
So, a customer after your own heart. Your reaction? I think Jean-Pierre mentioned packaging, how you could again scale that across all sorts of different industries. Yeah, what do you think?
We are a food and beverage company. Everything we sell is in a packaging, right? And that is also our gift to the consumer in a way. That's the only way we connect with them, what is written on it, what is being used in it. And therefore, it is absolutely essential for us to crack the code of packaging before we look at the rest of our operations. And we have to do it all, but I think packaging is the holy grail that will lead us to the connection with the consumer, but we are not there yet. Scientifically, we are not there yet. And therefore, you were asking about smaller companies versus larger companies. We realized we can't do it alone, and so we opened doors, and you'll be shocked. Within a month, we had 270 smaller startups on packaging coming to us and saying, we've got an idea. Do you want to invest? Do you want to scale? Do you want to partner? And we are doing that right now. So I think that's the game, partnerships with smaller and larger together.
And is a company like Asahi open to all sorts of new startups, smaller companies, perhaps
Absolutely.
untested in this field?
We always thought we have a pretty brilliant R&D division, we're fine. And it took us last year to say, okay, it's left punch, right punch. We're only halfway through. And we started it in September last year. We got 280 within a month. From 280, we're down to 9 right now who are actually doing projects or feasibility projects in 9 different locations in the world for us, and we're going to start this cycle again.
Jonathan, you mentioned that, I forget the exact figure, but a lot of people, perhaps even most people, would like to be more sustainable. Packaging is one of those direct, isn't it, connections with people, because everyone buys stuff, everyone gets annoyed about the endless packaging. Is it the holy grail in that sense, in the way Priti's just described it, in terms of winning consumers' hearts?
I think it is in certain categories. So Priti started out by saying we're a food and beverage business. I think for food and beverage businesses and other FMCG or CPG businesses, it's absolutely the place to start. Now, interestingly, will you get some sort of pat on the back from consumers for doing that? Absolutely not, because their expectations are such that you should be doing that anyway.
Yeah.
There are other areas where you want to get consumer advantage. However, if you're in other sectors or industries, as other people will be here today, then packaging is clearly not the place to start.
Right. Erin, you're smiling.
I'm smiling because, I used to lead the World Fair Trade Organization, and we did a lot of work with consumers who are buying fair trade products to understand how much the different issues matter. And we understood that, of course, we work mostly on social issues, on poverty, wages and incomes, for instance, in supply chains. That was critical. But consumers viscerally interact with the packaging. So they receive a product and they interact with it. And in the moment that they are disposing of it, there's a pain that evolves. There's a pain that emerges because you are disposing of all this energy, effort, material that went into creating this. Now, some of these circular and regenerative and much more effective models of packaging are great, but the number one goal should be, how do we have products that don't require packaging, that can have refillable products, and those solutions also need a lot more investment. And I feel like sometimes investment goes into, how do we keep doing what we're doing by just replacing a technical change on the edges of what we're doing. But this is what I mean by the core of the business model. The core of what are you actually providing in terms of solutions to society and the planet, are we ready and able to actually redesign that?
Right, and how much then, in terms of scientific development, how far ahead are we? Is everyone just waiting for that technological development that's going to make all of this so much easier, Jean-Pierre?
But it's a little bit like renewable energy replacing fossil fuels, right? There's no holy grail single solution to anything. So we need to have a variety and plethora of solutions. Yes, it's possible to integrate for some products, both product and package together, so you don't need the packaging. But sometimes you actually need packaging for protection, for providing information to your own consumer. So it's complicated, right? So I think what you're seeing is there's lots of investment going into innovation. There's lots of investment going into infrastructure, which are broadly the two categories, whether that's for reuse and refill or whether that's for recycling. But what we've also got to consider is a lot of this is happening in the global north, and the global south, the informal economy, those are the people who are affected by this. If we get rid of packaging, which is not going to happen, but if we were to get rid of packaging, what happens to those livelihoods? And so there's this whole tension, and it's a really complex situation we find ourselves in, that we've got to think this through very carefully without causing another problem.
We've got a question from journalists from the Global South in just a few minutes' time. Did you want to add something to that?
I think there's a supply, we've got to connect with supply and demand. At the moment, I think that's a sort of, if you don't mind me saying, it's a question that's framed from a supply point of view. There's so much technology out there already, so many organisations have these things that R&D have developed. Actually, what we're not doing well enough is framing those propositions, those technologies, those solutions in ways which actually connect with people. We're just expecting that they'll pick something up because it's sustainable, and that is a core assumption.
Well, then let me follow on with this question, because looking to the long term, Kantar's research shows that more than half of millennials and Gen Z consider choosing sustainable products and services as part of their core identity, and that includes the sort of employers they want to work for. So while there's a lot of focus on what's happened in the first months of 2025, looking down the line, maybe years down the line, is the momentum in fact now unstoppable?
I think it is. I mean, if you look at the wealth transfer from boomers to millennials and Gen Z, it's going to be $84.4 trillion in the US alone, estimated. So that value action gap that I was talking about before, the gap between people's stated values and beliefs and what they can actually do, will start to close, because those people's barriers around price will start to come down, because they'll have the economic wealth to follow through on what they believe in.
All right, well, no pressure in terms of time, but in about 15 seconds or so, I'm just going to get a sort of final thought before we open up to the journalist question, starting with you. Erich, what are the top things we need to see in order to, use the title of the session, maintain the momentum?
Well, we need to, firstly, not get fixated on some of the good things that are possible in the current system, because the majority of the transitions we need new kinds of enterprise designs, new kinds of corporate structures and financial models like steward ownership, employee ownership, new kinds of fund instruments as well, investment instruments that are going to unlock that kind of ambition. So in the enthusiasm to celebrate what's possible in today's realities, let's not undermine the kind of realities we need to actually unlock if we're going to make progress on the broader challenge.
Jean-Pierre?
So I would say that what we really need to focus on, without it sounding trite, is collaboration, right? So it's like, how do we not have 100 different pilot projects, but double down on maybe 5 or 10 globally that we can see economies of scale, whether that's for packaging or circular business models in our case. That's what we actually need, and we need to point organisations and governments in the right direction to say, here's a starting point, because I think everybody is completely overwhelmed by choice.
Pretty.
I think as a corporate, and like you said, we are the minority. I think we should, all the businesses who are actually doing work on sustainability need to be a little bit more brave, a little bit more loud and proud to share what they are doing, to show that there is actually momentum, and even better, share what is being done, but also what is not being done. Where are we failing? And I think you spoke about all the geopolitical movements and things that are happening in the world. I think we just need to calm our minds, steel our nerves, and just walk straight through what we need to do.
Jonathan?
I think it's this point about connecting supply and demand more carefully, and more powerfully, and I think it's understanding that the demand is there. It's very substantial. We just need to reframe desirability in the consumer society in a totally different way.
Well, it is time for questions from journalists around the world. Now, first of all, this from Bonnie Modiak-Gotler, business reporter at the Sunday Standard in Botswana, who asks, given the perception in many emerging markets like Botswana that ESG remains a donor-driven or compliance-based agenda, what strategies have proven most effective in localizing the ESG narrative to align with real economic security and job creation? Jean-Claude, do you want to take that first?
So I would say this is where circular economy comes into its own, right? So leading with the economic narrative really around this, rather than focusing on how do we do ESG reporting, but touching new business models and demonstrating that across the board is proving pretty effective. And again, this comes through economies, I'll keep coming back to economies of scale through collaboration, but really looking at circularity as a solution. It transcends backlashes, political boundaries. It's kind of an apolitical answer to a lot of things.
Aaron?
Well, I mean, I work on donut economics, which is all about the ecological boundaries that we must not overshoot and the social foundations that we must not fall short on. And in the global south, they're not the ones that are overusing planetary boundaries. It's the global north. So firstly, there is a fair and just way to use some of the planetary boundaries for economic development in the global south. Secondly, some of the ways that the global south economies and emerging market economies can leapfrog some of the broken 20th century corporate and financial structures are already being proven. We're beginning to see some really interesting models of co-ownership and place-based investment and ways that actually they're making sure when investment capital comes in, it's coming in on terms that stays, that doesn't have the opportunity to pressure the country to reduce its regulations, to drive down standards, but instead becomes a partner, but not the dominant partner in the kind of businesses that are emerging. Some of these are farmer-owned businesses or versions of those that are hybrid. Others have got all sorts of community ownership models baked into it. Companies like Selco in India, for instance, that have demonstrated that you can bring different kinds of capital in on different terms. I think that's the agenda. We need to shape the terms on which capital comes into countries and the terms on which it shapes the businesses themselves so that something bolder can emerge, so they can leapfrog over the problems we're trying to now unpick in the global north.
Preeti?
We operate in emerging economies, so we do have markets in Indonesia and Malaysia, and I think when we talk about climate change sustainability, I think 99% of us intuitively think environment only, but the social aspects are as huge. And I think to Jonathan's point, there is no point in me going to Indonesia and saying buy this product because it is less CO2. Doesn't make sense. But it does make sense when we are selling dairy products to young mothers who are struggling with unemployment in Indonesia. And then we start a campaign with our brand to create a fund which provides entrepreneurial training and financing for their businesses. And that is how the corporates can make a difference when we're talking about selling profitably but sustainably in the emerging markets.
Well, let's have a look at this or hear from Ryan McDonald, Senior Editor at Canada's Globe and Mail.
It's clear to me that ESG is evolving as a risk strategy, and that while some companies are abandoning their public commitments because of the kind of political short-termism that we're seeing in North America, there's many companies that still see value in ESG as a tool to define and manage and disclose that risk. So we have some cheerleaders and we have a lot of opponents, but to my mind, there's a third group that wants to preserve some ESG principles while abandoning the aspects that have not worked or have not proven their value. So my question for you then is, which aspects are less proven and which are the good bits, the ones that are worth highlighting? And most importantly, the ones that create long-term value for shareholders and that will build trust.
Ryan McDonald, though, who would like to take that first of all? Preeti?
There are all bits are good bits in sustainability. But I see the point that you're making, and I think and it's a very good question, by the way. We struggle with it as a corporate every day, and you have to find that balance. When we looked at renewable energy in Poland, it actually gave us a return on investment within a year. But I cannot do that in every single country. So you have to find the projects that will give you the returns in short term, then you have to find the ones that will take medium, and then you have your 2040, 2050 projects. And as a corporate, when you take it to your board or your investors, you have to show a balanced portfolio of sustainability investment. That's the only way you will be able to move the needle and the dialogue.
I mean, I think ESG did itself a disservice by focusing on what they call single materiality for so long. And this is such an absurd concept. It basically said the social or ecological only matters if it's going to hit my bottom line. So basically, my bottom line matters and the other bit only matters as long as it's in service to my bottom line, which is the definition of business as usual, which is just complete old wine in new bottles, right? So we lost a lot of faith in ESG because it presented itself as something that it wasn't, and now double materiality has come in, which is far more optimistic and far more bold and says, look, it might matter even if it's not going to impact your bottom line, and you should be able to act regardless. And that's the only bit that really matters, because the bit that already is incidentally in service to the bottom line, that'll happen anyway. People are good at looking for opportunities, finance flows accordingly, there are some inefficiencies, but by and large, that's happening. The bit that needs to happen is where there isn't a clear business case, and that's where the double materiality part comes in.
I do think on the risk and opportunity scale, there's been obviously so much focus on risk, and importantly there will be, and my favourite read at the moment is the Institute of Actuaries, who talk about, coin the concept, and it's a great bedtime read, the notion of planetary insolvency, saying there's too much economic dependency is not understood with regard to nature-related aspects at the moment. And I think so risk obviously still important, but that puts sustainability too much in the domain of legal and financial. I think in order to excite boards, we've got to think much more about opportunity. And functions like marketing, for example, who bring these things to life in the marketplace, their people are going to get much more excited by opportunity than they are by risk.
Interesting. This next question is from Philip Isakpa, Editor-in-Chief of Business AM in Nigeria, who says, in much of the global north, even where economic and other factors are making some companies consider a slowing of ESG push, there's still a broad understanding that it can't totally be taken off the table. However, in the global south, particularly in Africa, and more especially in Nigeria, where Business AM operates from as a media company, ESG issues are rather esoteric and even seen as a status symbol for the few companies that push them. How can a consensus be driven towards better understanding and a wider take-up by sectors within these economies instead of being a matter for a few companies belonging to a rich club? I mean, it's touching on a lot of what you've said already. I love this idea that it's just a bit esoteric, really, for a lot of companies. Is that what you found too?
I think it's such a brilliant question, and I think the point is that it goes back to this point around ESG being kind of an environmental only driver, right? But what we need to be focusing on, which is across the board, is socio-economic uplift. That touches everybody's lives. And so this socio-economic uplift lens of what do new innovative business models create? How can the global north learn from the global south around frugal innovation models, which are ubiquitous, but we think we're inventing it all in the north? How do we change this dialogue and lead with socio-economic uplift, which touches everybody's lives across the globe? Then environmental can come into it at an equal balancing act.
Preeti?
I'm with you. Love the question. But I just want to say that, we are talking about, even the concepts that we are talking about have come out of the global north. Double materiality, all of this cool stuff. And I say it's great to move fast and break things, but let's be prepared to replace it with something better, right? And it's going to be a transition. It's a journey from where we are to where we want to be. And therefore, it's essential to have the emerging economies feeding into every step of the way until we get to that ideal state where boards are like, Preeti, give me all your sustainability projects and I'll approve them all, right? But it has to be a step-by-step engagement between both North and South to move to that ideal state.
I mean, we've said a few things about how to excite boards, how would boards... Imagine if nature sat on the board, workers sat on the board, if the supply chain in the global south sat on the board. I can rattle off dozens of examples of companies that have that structure and make different decisions as a result. And I think it's true that we need to move beyond this esoteric approach to ESG, that we're just losing too much time, and instead move towards what's the economy we have to create if this amazing blue spinning wet rock of ours is going to sustain life into the future. What does this sector look like? What are we selling? How are we doing it? How are we behaving on this planet? And work backwards to then go, how do we belong to that economy? How does our company transform itself to belong to that economy? That question, I've worked with over 1,000 business leaders here at Donut Economics Action Lab, and that question captivates everybody. They all realize the economy that they want to belong to and ways that their company can fit in that economy. But in order to enable them to even have the agency to ask those questions, we need to start opening things up, including redesigning boards, redesigning ownership structures. Otherwise, we put a straitjacket on everyone and we're just running on a treadmill.
Right, but how far down the line are boards in having nature on the board or earth on the board, or even redesigning boards at perhaps a less esoteric level, if you like, in a way to sort of take those considerations on?
I think it's beginning to move. We're starting to see, entire Northern European economies, in Denmark, any company with over 30 employees has to have a third of their board representing their workers. This is one of the most resilient economies, with companies that are making much more long-term investments. They have a huge amount of foundation ownership, for instance, across their corporate world. We have a huge amount of diversity. In India, Amul is bigger than Nestle in terms of milk-based food products there. That's owned by over 3 million smallholder farmers, for instance. We've got these alternative models out there across the world, actually. What we need to do is have the imagination to realize, actually, this is an experiment, a proof of concept of how the mainstream economy can look everywhere. And let's innovate out of this stuck, old-fashioned view of the corporate world.
I think it's a great question, and I think we are seeing, as Ange points out, some narrative around this. So I work with the Climate Governance Initiative. 88% of board directors globally want to see more innovative ways of thinking at board level, and 84% want to see innovation through the sustainable transition and see that as a route to growth. And when you've got organisations like Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, there is a very current conversation there around the future of boards. So it is very much on the agenda.
Right, there's one just final question, Jean-Claude, to something that you mentioned earlier, that there are certain practices in certain industries that exist that will be seen as perhaps either gas guzzling or not very productive for the environment. But if you were to erase those industries, it would harm particularly areas in the global south. This is what they rely on. This is how they live and sustain themselves. What is the tension between wanting to progress with your climate change policies and not taking away people's livelihoods?
The tension and the solution lies in the circular economy, because if you're designing business models that benefit, so for example, take mining, take critical minerals. If mining communities could benefit from secondary and tertiary sales, then they would be less predisposed to having to extract in the first place. So thinking that through, the problem is it's just easier because we're so dependent on the linear economy. And if we redesign this and start experimenting with different ways, but taking those considerations into consideration, then things start to change.
We are pretty well out of time, I'm afraid, for this session. My thanks to all of you, all the panellists here. It's fascinating listening to you. Let's give them a round of applause. But don't go away or don't go too far. We're going to be back in 30 minutes with our second session of the day, taking a closer look at the business of decarbonisation. See you soon. Hello.
Hello.
Hello and welcome.
We're live in New York City for Climate Week.
This Project Syndicate conference today with some great speakers.
We're coming together to discuss a topic no less important than the future of life on Earth.
We've just entered what is the decisive decade.
This is about saving the conditions that have allowed the human race to survive.
The world's green recovery from the pandemic is the centre of a virtual conference which will feature speakers from across the world.
It's time to open up the floor with questions from journalists around the world.
Leaders need to listen. The choice is radical change today or disaster tomorrow.
The crisis of relevance of the United Nations is, I think, much bigger than many people want to admit.
So the question is, are we ready to change?
So that's the opportunity in front of all of us, through collective action, to start reducing the impact of consumer goods on planet Earth.
We've got so many things happening in the world, and how do we, as our organization, help to raise the water level for everybody?
I think it makes a lot of sense to have initiatives where you have all the stakeholders around the table to create the next era of impact. I would hope that in 10 years' time we have tremendously reduced the environmental impact of production, while at the same time creating equal partnership and fair business models.
So I felt Cascale actually brings that kind of competencies and the tools and the programs so that we can collectively really reduce the negative impacts, at the same time create the positive impacts to the world.
I would love 10 years from now to come back here and be able to look at this group and say, wow, we have been a more effective agent for solutions than all the governments in the world put together.
Cascale. Cascale. Cascale.
Cascale.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello and welcome.
We're live in New York City for Climate Week.
This Project Syndicate conference today with some great speakers.
We're coming together to discuss a topic no less important than the future of life on Earth.
We've just entered what is the decisive decade.
This is about saving the conditions that have allowed the human race to survive.
The world's green recovery from the pandemic is the centre of a virtual conference which will feature speakers from across the world.
It's time to open up the floor with questions from journalists around the world.
Leaders need to listen. The choice is a radical change today or disaster tomorrow.
The crisis of relevance of the United Nations is, I think, much bigger than many people want to admit.
So the question is, are we ready to change?
So that's the opportunity in front of all of us, through collective action, to start reducing the impact of consumer goods on planet Earth.
We've got so many things happening in the world, and how do we, as our organization, help to raise the water level for everybody?
I think it makes a lot of sense to have initiatives where you have all the stakeholders around the table to create the next era of impact. I would hope that in 10 years' time we have tremendously reduced the environmental impact of production, while at the same time creating equal partnership and fair business models.
So I felt Cascale actually brings that kind of competencies and the tools and the programs so that we can collectively really reduce the negative impacts, at the same time create the positive impacts to the world.
I would love 10 years from now to come back here and be able to look at this group and say, wow, we have been a more effective agent for solutions than all the governments in the world put together.
Cascale.
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 Hello.
Hello.
Hello and welcome.
We're live in New York City for Climate Week.
This Project Syndicate conference today with some great speakers.
We're coming together to discuss a topic no less important than the future of life on Earth.
We've just entered what is the decisive decade.
This is about saving the conditions that have allowed the human race to survive.
The world's green recovery from the pandemic is the centre of a virtual conference which will feature speakers from across the world.
It's time to open up the floor with questions from journalists around the world.
Leaders need to listen. The choice is radical change today or disaster tomorrow.
The crisis of relevance of the United Nations is, I think, much bigger than many people want to admit.
So the question is, are we ready to change?
So that's the opportunity in front of all of us, through collective action, to start reducing the impact of consumer goods on planet Earth.
We've got so many things happening in the world, and how do we, as our organization, help to raise the water level for everybody?
I think it makes a lot of sense to have initiatives where you have all the stakeholders around the table to create the next era of impact. I would hope that in 10 years' time we have tremendously reduced the environmental impact of production, while at the same time creating equal partnership and fair business models.
So I felt Cascale actually brings that kind of competencies and the tools and the programs so that we can collectively really reduce the negative impacts, at the same time create the positive impacts to the world.
I would love 10 years from now to come back here and be able to look at this group and say, wow, we have been a more effective agent for solutions than all the governments in the world put together.
Cascale. Cascale. Cascale.
Cascale.
Hello again, I'm Jo Coburn and welcome back to London Climate Action Week 2025, brought to you by Project Syndicate at High House. Thanks very much for bearing with us while we were fixing a technical gremlin here. It does happen, unfortunately. We're getting down to business now. That's the business of decarbonisation. Crucially, while companies can easily control their own behaviour, what about the environmental impact of the materials, products, and everything else that they buy? Without taking responsibility for supply chains, can companies really claim to be green? We'll be taking a special look at the fashion industry, where ambitions to reduce emissions are not being met, and supply chains are a crucial factor.
A mountain ridge of garbage mars the beauty of this beach in Ghana. One of the chief culprits, textile waste from industrialized nations in the West.
Uno puede escarbar nomás un poquito y sale toda la... Estos cerros que se ven así a simple vista como un cerro, están llenos de ropa.
My fellow Americans, this is Liberation Day. In a few moments, I will sign a historic executive order instituting reciprocal tariffs on countries throughout the world.
Now, here to dissect the issues for the fashion industry and beyond, let me introduce our panel. Executive Vice President of Cascale, Andrew Martin. Stientje van Veldhoven, who is Global Vice President and Regional Director for Europe at the World Resources Institute. Seb Henbest, Group Head of Climate Transition at HSBC, and Jodie Keane, Senior Research Fellow with the International Economic Development Group at ODI. Welcome to you all, and a round of applause to welcome our guests for being so patient. And just a quick reminder before we start, we'd love you to join in the conversation too, so please do get involved using the hashtag #PSEvents. Can I start with you, Andrew, just to kick us off? Let's start with the scale of the problem by taking a look at one of the stats that we saw in the setup film. The scale of Cascale's emissions ambitions for the fashion industry. A 45% reduction, at least, of greenhouse gases across the value chain by 2030. But currently, emissions are going the other way. What do you think the problem is?
Oof. The problem is, it's a mix, I think, of a lack of action. I think that's where I would start. It's a lack of action from the industry together. The good news, I can give you some good news.
Always like good news.
To start with, which is, for those who don't know, Cascale used to be the Sustainable Apparel Coalition. We set up to create an aligned measurement system for the industry called the Higg Index. Over those last 10, 15 years we've been collecting the data, we actually know where the impacts are in the industry. So we have a really good picture. For those of you that don't know, that it comes to making products, garments, that comes from the raw materials, the cotton, whatever. It comes from turning that into fiber, turning that into fabric, making a garment. The garment making of it is quite small. There's a huge percentage in the rest of it. With the data we've got, we actually can now identify that about 10% of the facilities, the factories making the garments, the products, the fabrics, account for 80% of emissions. And we know, this is the good news, we know which factories they are, we know where they are, we know what country they're in, we know what their energy mix is, we know what the facilities are like, we know all of this, and we even know who they're buying, who's buying from them, which brands. That's the good news. The challenge is, how do we turn that? And that's the process we're in at the moment, going through, trying to bring the industry together to look at, we've got this data, we've got the knowledge. So the start point is we know. What we're not doing is working fast enough in a collaborative way to actually address those with solutions that we know are possible.
Right, well, we'll come back perhaps to having identified the polluters, perhaps we can call them that more broadly, how you actually single them out for action. But if we step back a bit, Jodie, and look more broadly, can fashion and consumer industries, which are essentially based on all of us consuming more at the lowest possible price, ever become sustainable?
I think they can, and I think we are seeing that in some parts of the world. So the textiles and clothing chain, it's no exaggeration to say that this industry has helped make the modern world. You know, it kind of powered the Industrial Revolution and then industrial revolutions elsewhere through the fragmentation of production that you described. So you have entrants into the market that are now seeking to kind of retrofit that are perhaps powered predominantly by coal, but nonetheless they are making efforts to increase solar energy production and so on. But then you also have other parts of the world that can learn and see what has happened. They appreciate the current scale of the challenge. And here I'm thinking about producers more in the west of Africa who use more natural-based fibres, cotton. An example is Benin, for example. It has industrial parks powered by thermal and solar energy. So its starting point is this new landscape. So I think it certainly can be made much more sustainable. It just depends on, you know, where you are and then the resources.
Because perhaps you can give us a sense of the size of the employment in those sorts of industries. That's also a big factor, isn't it? Particularly in cotton, for example.
It is, and it comes down to where producers are positioned. So do they have the backward linkage? Do they have the textiles production? And are they then moving into the garment production as well? Bangladesh, you know, managed to tap into the garment stage of production. There's around 8 million people employed, around 8% of GDP, mostly women. So it's a huge sector, around 80% of exports as well. So it's a huge sector, a huge driver of growth, and it has lifted millions of people out of poverty.
Yes.
An overall picture. There's about, different reports, numbers are always difficult to follow, but somewhere between 100 and 300 million workers are in the garment industry. That's a huge amount of people. And I think your point about Bangladesh is really important. The country has been transformed positively. There are challenges, there are problems, we can talk about them, but it has been transformed positively because of the industry.
Stinja, what are the biggest blockages in your mind for the other big emitting industries?
Well, I think in general, if we take a little bit of a helicopter view, and we see that the world is going to 9-10 billion people, and that will have a middle class, which fortunately will be a lot larger, about 3 billion people, that's going to triple our resource consumption. So if we look at this industry, we look at other industries, there's no way, unless we find a way how to grow our planet, that our resources overall are not going to be more constrained, and that's going to impact every sector. And so every sector will have to think about a world in which the available resources are used in a much more efficient way. And fortunately, of course, the fact that we have reached a certain tipping point in the clean energy revolution that is no longer just dependent on a particular country or a few countries in a coalition of the willing, that is actually fueling now a different development in the overall industry. And I think that will be relevant for many industries, including also the apparel industry, because it enables different kinds of processes to become part of what the new reality is.
Right, but is the overall message consume less?
Well, I think the overall message is we only have one planet, so we'll have to be more efficient. And the question of decoupling growth from efficiency of use of resources is a different message, and literally also is a different model than just saying consume less. But I must say, if there is a new fashion line every 6 weeks in the stores, I'm not sure that if we switch that to every 12 weeks, which would reduce the problem to a certain extent, whether that would fall under consume less, not sure. So there's things I think that can be done in any industry, right, which are low-hanging fruit, and that can greatly reduce also the impact of these industries. And as you know, right, as you said, measuring is key. So knowing where the hotspots are is, of course, key to then developing those efficient strategies.
So, but what are the biggest barriers your clients face in setting emissions targets?
Well, let me start by saying that this is the biggest, most difficult challenge that anyone has ever faced in the history of humankind. So when we're thinking about our clients, they're trying to navigate a rewiring of the world economy that needs to go quickly and it needs to go in an orderly fashion. They've got shareholders, they've got a lot of constraints on them. And they're working in a world where the demand for what they do is growing. So you've got to rewire as you're growing. You've got to walk and chew gum at the same time, as the Americans sometimes say. And so, we see this juxtaposition between the drivers of growth and the drivers of competition and how we get emissions down at the same time. And so it becomes a technology problem fundamentally. Because the question you asked before is that, does this mean less consumption? I don't think that's a successful strategy.
No.
I don't think it will be less.
Message, yeah.
Yeah, and it's not a message that resonates with anybody who's striving to live richer lives. At HSBC, we recognise there's 200 trillion worth of investment needs to flow in the next 25 years. So the private sector's got a very important role to play, and our strategy is to engage with our clients to help them to do the transition they need to do, and they're doing it for loads of different reasons, right? It's not just because there's a climate policy, and I know we'll get onto this, but we look at the political messiness of the last 6 months and go, what does that mean? Well, actually, they're responding to a number of different drivers, and our ability to help them is how we succeed. And it's our superpower to work with our clients. It's the only leverage we've got, right? There's plenty of money sloshing around in the world economy. It's what can we do? Well, we can help them to understand the technology space, understand what they're doing, and we've built some tools that help our smaller customers do that, and our bigger ones this is front and center. So your question of what is the hardest issue for them to tackle? I think the fact that it's not a one-size-fits-all approach is fundamentally difficult, which means that every client that we work with is trying to navigate a whole set of constraints, and it's almost first of a kind. There's a little bit of cookie cutter nature to it in terms of the technology mix or the rates of change or the markets, but every customer is so different. And that makes it fundamentally inventing the wheel for the first time.
Yes, but on that basis then, let's talk a bit about collaboration and whether that is part of the answer. Jodie, I'll get you to respond to this year's Pricewaterhouse State of Decarbonization report chart, and it shows that around 70% of companies believe that business success lies in collaborating across the supply chain as well as with customers. How much does that actually happen at the moment?
Gosh, I guess it depends on how far companies want to go down their supply chain, and the fact that you've got some producers that have then sought to kind of move up the value chain so that they undertake more functions there. But I think it hits on a kind of more fundamental point that we're using kind of tools like trade policy, industrial policy, but this sort of approach is more like an innovations system approach where you're getting different stakeholders together, because it is a technology-related challenge, a finance-related challenge. So it's a kind of different sort of interventions that we need. It's about learning from what works, what doesn't work. So I always couch this in terms of an innovation systems framework. It's thinking about how chambers of commerce interact both in country but also between countries as well. And I don't think we've quite got that new ecosystem of support quite right yet, but that's what we need.
Steve?
Yeah, I love the fact that you mentioned the word systemic, because that's also what I try to allude to. I think we need certain changes in the system so that it's not just a technical problem or a financing problem or a policy problem. It is all combined, right? Or an innovation problem. So how do we find those levers that will help unlock most of the system? And to give you a very nice example, in my previous role as part of the Dutch government, and as a member of the government, you could take the king to one working visit. And I was responsible for circularity, and I took the king to a small family-owned business that made 100% circular clothing. Now, they were only a small business, and of course the Netherlands has this favorable environment for circularity, etc. Yes, I mean, it's only small, and it's not part of a worldwide agreement on circularity or anything. But they said, our market is a market for 100% circular work clothing. That's our product, that's what we produce. If you want that, you come to us. If you don't want that, don't come to us. That was their market. Then they went to work with a mill in Turkey, and they went to talk to their partner in Pakistan. And they said, are you going to come on this journey with us? And so they were able to transform this business chain with their mill in Turkey, right, with their partner in Pakistan. And none of those companies had a governmental or a financial environment that was specifically conducive to circularity. But this supply chain gave them a reason, gave them a market to change. And so I think this percentage of companies engaging with stakeholders, I would hope that would go up to 90 or 100%, because that is how you can actually change a system.
By when?
We're not there now.
By when?
Well, I mean, that's a very interesting question. I think all of us are very much aware of the challenge, right? All of us are very much aware of the need and the urgency to change. So we look towards the end of the decade. At the same time, many people, also here in London, but everywhere, are looking at the end of the month. So how do we find a way to step by step set very ambitious targets, but also make sure that people feel it's also for them, it's achievable for them. I'm sure you have a lot of experience also in how to drive that step-by-step change, because we do need to know where we're going, and I'm sure this target setting that you do will help companies also set a target and step-by-step achieve it.
Can I pick up on the collaboration piece from a slightly different perspective and sort of challenge some of what was just said, because it's anecdotal. We had a major manufacturer forum in Vietnam a month ago. It was our biggest event, 650 people. We did a poll, and it was mainly manufacturers, so mainly the people who actually make the product that we're all wearing. And we did a poll on what is the biggest hindrance to you driving decarbonisation in your business. And we gave them options. One of the options was technology and technology solutions. One was finance. One was alignment amongst their customers, their brands, on processes and on impacts and programs, and the last one was around brand commitments. The number one was alignment amongst brands, 42%. Finance was actually the lowest one.
Really?
Which I was really surprised at. Technology solutions was the second lowest. And in our conversations with the manufacturing community, something we're doing a lot more of, and I think it came up in the last one around, we tend to have global north solutions that we think are right. Our conversations with the manufacturing community and the suppliers is they actually have a lot of the solutions. They think they know their business. They know what to do. And engaging with them more is much more important. What hinders them is 20 customers, and a lot of them, we have manufacturers who have 20 of our members who are their customers, who have different targets, who have different audit systems, who have different decarbonisation programs, different science-based targets, and they're going, how the hell can we actually make anything happen when I'm spending all my time writing reports, doing this program? If you could align, that's the thing about collaboration for me that would make a huge difference, something we're trying to drive with our members, and that's critical.
Right, well, just take a look at this for a moment.
Once again, as of today, we have 0 ships at berth right now at the Port of Seattle. Our sister port in Tacoma currently has 1 ship, as well as a ro-ro carrier, that's a car carrier.
The United States is grappling with an economic crisis rapidly unfolding at its ports and threatening to ripple through the entire economy.
Sudden shocks that we have experienced in recent months and really over the last decade or so, whatever you want to pick, from the financial crash to the war in Ukraine, COVID, and so on and so forth. President Trump's tariff policies probably being one of the most recent. When it comes to businesses and supply chains, how can they ever hope to keep up with new ESG policies and measures when the atmosphere is so febrile? Jodie?
Sure. I mean, I think it's not just the ESG agenda, it's also the kind of outright protectionism as well that we saw on Liberation Day, the imposition of tariffs on countries like Lesotho, and this is going to hit the textiles and clothing industry, and this has benefited from preferences that have been made available through the African Growth and Opportunity Act. And all of that future is really uncertain at the moment. So it has implications for Lesotho, knock-on effects on South Africa, because you've got regional production networks as well. So for me, I see both the ESG agenda, which, is positive, there's interest, there's business gets it, but then you've got this outright protectionism as well. And this is the landscape that producers are operating in at the current time. So it's very challenging. It's putting a strain on government officials. They're negotiating time, they're negotiating capacity. Business associations as well, who are already kind of grappling with the number of different systems, number of different audits required across different types of suppliers. So it's really, really tricky, and this all adds costs. And this is part of the kind of green squeeze that we've been highlighting, the fact that costs are increasing, but the price premium for products are not, and that is the challenge.
Because then how do you advise your clients? I mean, what can you say to them when you're not sure what's going to be coming down the track in maybe a few weeks' time, never mind a few years' time? Does that lead to retrenchment in that sense?
Well, I mean, I think you can differentiate with clients around understanding sort of the rules of the game, which do change and are very difficult and create costs. And on the other side is the strategic decisions they can make to improve their businesses. And there's now multiple lines of evidence that sustainability as part of a business strategy is good for business, right? And part of that's to do with the fact that you can reduce costs just because you're focusing on cost savings, efficiencies, on new technology innovation. I mean, HSBC, we're one of the philanthropic funders of the Apparel Impact Institute, and a sort of a seed fund that's designed to try and scale innovation and things like that, because there really, really is a premium in the medium to long term on new technology. And the tricky part is the bit in between. But the bit in between is also, the argument for sustainability in the bit in between is also to do with resilience, to manage shocks, about energy security, supply chain security. And it's almost like this issue is a way to navigate that uncertainty. And I think that we could find on the back of this that uncertainty ain't going to go away.
No.
But as a result of the increased uncertainty, businesses are much more focused on trying to future-proof themselves in that uncertain environment, make the investments that are enabling them to have a strong business case into the future, rather than just trading sort of day to day.
Right, but how much do organisations know about their supply chains, especially the further along you go? And dare I say it, maybe some suppliers aren't completely open about what is going on. Andrew, you're nodding.
Yeah, how much do they know? It depends who you talk to. There's a spectrum. There are those who really go deep. There are some we have members of ours who actually have there's one. I think Everlane is a brand who basically have visibility right through to tier 4, and you can see the access and you see the names. Okay. So there are some pioneering. I think it's a really good point, Seb, because for us, sustainability becoming a business operation, a business imperative, it's actually the shift that we need to see now. I think that's the bit that's gonna transform this from. I think there was a talk in the last session about, I can't remember how it was framed, this sort of being a nice to have.
Yeah.
And even the thing about ESG reporting, it's almost, and it's not everywhere, if this starts to become a norm in businesses from a risk perspective, resilience, I am actually quite inspired by what's happening in the Global South with some of the manufacturers we work with. And in this context, I kind of have this view that we're at a turning point, potentially, in some of what's going on in Asia, leading the world in terms of where this is going. There's more progressive regulation in Vietnam. Vietnam's got the TPPA, I think it's, I can't remember what it is, Discourse or whatever it is, 6, which actually all companies have to do GHG inventories, China's climate energy piece. There's a lot actually happening in the Global South, despite all the tariffs and trade and what's going on. So I think there could be a shift here.
So you think there's a pivot, almost towards the Global South? Yes.
Just coming back to the part of your question, which was, the sort of second-order suppliers and the difficulty of trade. I mean, HSBC is the world's biggest trade bank. We do supply chain and trade finance really well. We do sustainable supply chain finance really well. When it's a big buyer and a major seller, that's really straightforward. We do it all the time. When it gets complicated is when you're going to tier 2, tier 3, and you have these big complex supply chains. Yeah. And the big end of the retail market, whether it's fashion or anything else, has really complex supply chains. And so the challenge is to try and engineer the right partnerships within that supply chain to enable a bank, with a certain amount of risk appetite,
yes,
to finance a lot of smaller suppliers through the relationship and the offtake that they have with these larger companies. So we can sort of de-risk the capital to smaller companies that we might otherwise not be able to finance. And there's a whole sort of ecosystem of financial solutions trying to solve that problem. But there's no one size fits all, which makes them very, very sort of time expensive to engineer.
Well, Stinja, can I get you to respond to a report that we're going to show you from the BBC on some international cooperation on decarbonisation that flew a little bit under the radar amidst all the recent geopolitical gloom and doom. And this is the International Maritime Organization's step towards a legally binding framework to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions from shipping to net zero around 2050, the first in the world, to combine mandatory emissions limits and GHG pricing across an entire industry sector. Do you think this is going to set, how big a deal is this in your mind, and is it really going to sort of set a precedent?
This is a very big deal. Also, I think that in the midst of we see international collaboration, international treaties, etc., becoming more and more difficult around the world, and you might think that it becomes hard to do anything at all. But here is the IMO indeed having this breakthrough in the midst of all this. And indeed, this is a sector which, of course, you can only very effectively tackle globally, because it's literally going from one jurisdiction to the next. So how do you ever going to do that nationally? But there was sufficient wish with big partners to actually create that change to, in the end, create this global breakthrough. I really think that's what it is.
Right.
The shipping emissions are in any product that we use. And therefore, having this instrument that will then level and invest in greening the shipping is I think, a really bright spot amidst so much that we still have to do, because like you started with, right, we're not on track. We're still not going the right direction, but there are things that are real good signs. The tipping point in renewable energy that I just mentioned, these kind of breakthroughs.
Yeah.
And also Asia. You mentioned Asia. I think uncertainty is the new certain, right? I think that's for all of us. You already mentioned a couple of crises that we've had to deal with. And so we will need to hedge against an unstable world. We do see, however, that whereas maybe the US is on one hand, on one side, extreme side of the sustainability revolution, China and Asia are very much on the other side. And we see, as the World Resources Institute, of course, many dynamics in many parts of the world. Yeah. And in Asia, we see a lot of very positive dynamic that I think can also, together, hopefully, with Europe, continue to be leaders for a push for change in this direction, which we'll all need in the end, or we'll all pay the price for it. But let's keep it optimistic and say there's really hope and reason for optimism also if you look at what's happening in Asia.
Jodie, you wanted to respond.
Yeah.
Global breakthrough.
I do also agree that it is, and it also helps us to focus our attention not just on kind of territorial country emissions, but also across the whole kind of consumption pathway. So I think in that sense it's really positive. I guess the key question is, where will the revenues raised go? And if they're reinvested into cleaner fuels and whatnot, that's fantastic. But I do still feel that there's a bit of an issue around the transition, and some countries are concerned that there may be increased costs for shipping, and then this then gets passed down through the supply chain. So just because they're further away from consumer markets, they may become less competitive. So that is a very real concern and challenge. It's also something that we can see across some other sectors. So I'm involved with some work which is a group called Fair Miles, which is trying to talk with companies, you know, if they're adapting their transportation methods, trying to reduce emissions, can they do so in a way that doesn't penalise countries, poorer countries, that just because they tend to be more geographically further away. So I think that is a concern of ours at the moment, but there are ways around it.
And do you think there could be international collaboration in the way we've just seen with this particular breakthrough in the fashion industry?
I think there could. I think it's something that we're trying to do, and our decarbonisation programme is actually about bringing together different initiatives. One of the challenges we have in the space, particularly where we work, is having somebody like a UN to step in and actually do that for us. So as an industry, we're trying to do it. We're actually doing some work at the moment on convening the industry on foundational environmental expectations in all facilities. So that kind of thing is happening. But I did want to pick up on another point, if I can.
Yes.
When you mentioned about prices being passed on and things like that, one thing that we really do a big focus on is responsible purchasing. And responsible purchasing practices, and I think you can do it from the financing side, you can do it from the risk side, actually is proven to be better and more beneficial for businesses. And I think that's where I was talking to a big manufacturer member who was saying, under the tariffs recently, he literally had major US customers operating from one end of the spectrum saying, you know what, this is all, I'm going to pass all the cost to you. It's literally everything, not just the cost, it's like it's going to increase the selling price, therefore I want the difference. It was everything. Right to the other end, they had long-term relationships with businesses they were working with, brands, a couple of them who came to them and said, it's not your problem. It's an American problem, it's not your problem. I know the companies involved, and I know which ones are more financially secure, and I know which ones actually are more likely to survive. And so I think it's good business practice to be actually having fair terms, longer term contracts, and responsible purchasing.
Let's take a question from a journalist. This first is from Juliana Miranda of Brazil's Folha de Sao Paulo, who asks, amid an unfavourable geopolitical landscape, we're seeing several companies such as oil firms and banks backtrack on their decarbonisation commitments without any embarrassment. Could this mean that the commitment to the energy transition depends much more on signals from governments than on a genuine concern from corporations? Who would like to take that?
I'll have a crack to start off with, because you did mention banks, which puts me on. But listen, I think that the challenge here is that the world economy is moving at a pace that no one organisation can control, no one country can control. And the changes that we're seeing or not seeing is the aggregate of a whole bunch of micro decisions that emerge out, and that's called the world economy, right? Fundamentally, we can't wean ourselves off fossil fuels in our energy system while demand for them is still high. And it's as simple as that. So if you're thinking about, well, you know, the fossil fuel companies have rolled back on some of their commitments, it's because they're selling their core product hand over fist. And the ones who are not are getting hit on the stock market. So they've got to think about how they navigate this transition, because it is a transition. It's not just an all in, all out. It's not like this binary, you know, we go from here to there. It's this messy, messy pathway from the world economy we have today to a different one. And those companies are trying to navigate. Now, some of them are making bets and going, do you know what? This will happen, but not anytime soon. And as a result, I'm going to crack on with core business until I see some really material signals in the marketplace. And others are going to front run it. And some of the European oil majors have done that. They've front run it and gone, we've got to get out in front. And then they've been punished because the world economy hasn't moved. And the rate at which the overall economy moves is a function of a lot of different actors. But fundamentally, you need price signals. And that's when it comes down to government policy, regs, the rules of the game, the boundary conditions, because you can't ask any private sector organisation to make a change that hits its profits and hits its shareholders. And I heard this wonderful phrase this morning at a different thing I was at, which says about green grids that we were hosting at HSBC. And a fellow said, there's no transition with red numbers. And I think that's fundamentally why you've seen some of the rollback from the oil and gas companies. And the solution to that is demand destruction. And that means investing in supporting the technologies and the businesses that will displace that demand.
Okay.
Because we're not going to travel less, right? And that's 50% of oil demand is road transport. We're not going to convince everyone to travel less. But if they're driving an electric car, that undermines the oil demand,
All right.
and then the story changes.
We've got time for one more question from the editorial director of Romania's Economistul Quarterly, Daniel Apostol. Here he is.
At the EU level, member states must comply with ENZIA regarding measures for decarbonizing industries and energy transition. However, a country like Romania has natural resources, including natural gas deposits, which, through their exploitation, can ensure regional energy security, independence from Russian natural gas, and could also help support the cost of the energy transition. Investments in new technologies such as CCS are expensive, and Romania is somewhat penalized by having to handle in a short period of time the largest amount of CO2 for storage, almost a quarter of the EU quota. The question: how should the energy transition be managed in this case?
Andrew, I don't want to put any pressure on you, but you've got about 30 seconds.
Wow.
To answer that question.
Really not my area of expertise. I'm just going to be straight on. I'm like, it's a great question, but I don't know.
CO2 storage? Anyone in 30 seconds?
I just missed the beginning of the question.
I think we all did.
Yeah.
So, but in terms, yes, Jodie.
I think that the focus on carbon capture and storage that was mentioned there, it's not the challenge. It's not only faced. The challenge is not only faced by Romania. It's also faced by other countries, including India. I was on a call this morning talking about decarbonisation of steel in India, and for the kind of blast furnaces, this is where the carbon capture storage really comes into play. But again, it comes down to investment and technology transfer, and the right partnerships, and they haven't quite got that yet.
You've got 10 seconds.
And the 10 seconds is. I'd just say, like, we've got to think about transition in two parts. One is the deployment of the things that are economic, scaled, and available off the shelf today, and the other is the new technologies that solve, frankly, what is probably 25 to 30% of the problem, and CCS is one of those. So important, but we shouldn't think that it's economic today, that it's cost-effective today. We need to invest in it today, but it is really a tomorrow technology.
I'm so sorry to hurry you along. Thank you so much. Yes, you can relax now. Let's give them a round of applause for being a great panel. Thank you, and well done for interpreting the questions there at the end. I'm going to let you all take your seats. Thank you again. You can relax now for a few minutes, because after those thought-provoking sessions, we're going to bring the podium right to the fore here. And just as that is settling in, and please be careful of the cables as you go down to our four great panelists, I would like to welcome Adair Turner, Member of the House of Lords here in the UK and Chair of the Energy Transitions Commission, to give us some closing thoughts. So if Adair Turner, here he is, can make his way to the podium.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to be talking at a Project Syndicate event. I don't know how many of you knew about Project Syndicate before you came today. I've known it for about 12 years or so, and have been reading it and also writing for it on and off. Sometimes Ken Murphy, who runs it, says, Adair, you did promise to do once a month. Where the hell is your article? So I'm a bit intermittent, but I'm getting more regular at the moment, and I write for it because it really is a place of open, intelligent debate in a world where there isn't enough open, intelligent debate. So I'm very pleased also that they've had this event here, and Project Syndicate are doing more and more events. They've asked me to give some concluding comments about, well, where are we with this energy transition, and where are we with the climate here at the start of London Climate Action Week. And I'm afraid if I was going to start with where are we on emissions reductions and where are we on the climate, we're going to get pretty depressed. The fact is that despite a whole series of commitments that we're going to turn the corner and head towards net zero by 2050 or 2060, we are not yet at the peak, or if we are, we're only just getting there this year, and emissions have continued to go up. And it's very clear that the climate is now, I think, in an above 1.5 degree mode. We were clearly above it last year, partly an El Nino effect. There may be a slight decline this year, though not much evidence of that in the first 4 months of the year. But the World Meteorological Organization is saying that there's a more than 70% chance that we will average over 1.5 degrees centigrade for the next 5 years. And if we average that for the next 5 years, we'll average it for the next 5 years thereafter. Now, you can make yourself happy by saying that when Paris commitment said we want ideally to aim for 1.5 degrees, they meant 1.5 degrees on a multi-decade average. And of course, we won't get to there on a multi-decade average for several more decades. But the fact is, we're already in a plus 1.5 degree world, and we are seeing the effect in terms of local weather events, which are having very harmful effects for human welfare. And where are we actually heading at the moment? Well, the International Energy Agency says that on the basis of current policies across the world, i.e. the actual policies in place, the carbon prices, the regulations, not just pledges, I promise to get to net zero, but have you policies in place that we're heading to plus 2.4 degrees centigrade warming by the end of the century. And that estimate was in last year's World Energy Outlook, which was before the impact of Donald Trump. And Donald Trump is very bad for global climate. Sometimes when bad things happen, people like whistling in the dark and telling stories about, oh no, there are individual states and cities still in for the process. No, what has happened in America is very bad. It's difficult to turn that into exactly what it means. My own somewhat subjective feel is that I've now added about 0.2 degrees centigrade to whatever was my previous estimate of where we'd be in 2100 or 2050. So look, I've decided to start by depressing you all, but also, I hope, by giving you an idea that we've got to grasp the opportunities wherever we have to turn this thing around, because otherwise we're on a path to do something really catastrophic to human welfare. And here's the good news. The good news is the technologies that can solve it. Because even while the climate trends and the emission trends have been going in the wrong direction, what we see in the technology side is extraordinary. And what we see at the Energy Transition Commission, which I chair, we think about a spectrum of technologies. Let's divide it into roughly two categories. There are a number of technologies which have gone far faster than we dreamed in cost reduction and gone to the stage where they are now cheaper than the fossil fuel alternative. The cost of solar PV has fallen over the last 50 years, not 90%, not 99%, but 99.9%. Think about that. The cost of solar PV panels is a thousandth of what it was in 1975 and has come down 90% over the last 15 years. It keeps on going down. When I was the first chair of the UK Climate Change Committee, we did a lot of bits back in 2008 to 12. We did a lot of thinking about what the technology trends would be for the future, how fast different technologies costs would come down. We were absolutely and utterly useless at it. We thought by the early 2020s, solar PV costs might have come down 25%. They've come down 90%. Battery costs have come down 95% in the last 2 years. As a result, EVs in China, and I hope across the rest of the world soon, are now cheaper to buy up front. Not to operate over their life, but cheaper to buy up front than internal combustion engine sizes of equivalent performance and size. And once that occurs, people are going to realize that they're cheaper to buy up front and they're cheaper to run. The internal combustion engine is dead. We just haven't got round to burying it yet. But the transition to EVs is going to happen far, far faster than people realize. Solar plus batteries together are going to create what I call the killer app of the energy transition. In many places, not here in the UK, where, except on days like today, our sunshine is somewhat limited, but in what we call the sun belt of the world, in Africa, in India, in the whole mid-latitude, low-latitude countries, solar plus batteries is going to be a combination capable of providing electricity round the clock. And if you want proof of that, go to India, which has been an extraordinary innovator in contract structures in power markets, where they demand that solar or wind developers don't just say, well, here's my wind farm and I'll sell you the kilowatt hours when I feel like it, when the wind is blowing. They have to meet a commitment to provide electricity on a round-the-clock basis. 80% of all hours of the year, and increasingly now on what they call a time-slotted basis, half hour by half hour, with the regulator able to say, I want electricity from you tomorrow afternoon between 5:30 and 6, whether the sun's shining or the wind's blowing or not. And we are seeing those round-the-clock auctions coming in at prices as low as $40 per megawatt hour, which is below the cost of any new coal and increasingly competitive with existing coal. So there are a set of technologies. They also include heat pumps for residential homes, where we need them in the high latitude countries, which are now cost competitive. They've gone past the tipping point. At the other end, there are a set of technological areas or sectors which we call the hard-to-abate sectors of the economy: steel and cement, chemicals, aviation, shipping. Here we do not yet have, and by the way, we may never have, technologies which are actually cheaper than fossil fuels, but we do have technologies which can take us to net zero. For every one of these sectors, I can name a technology that could get us there, and which is already being applied today. We can make steel using hydrogen as a direct reduction agent rather than coking coal. We can also apply, which was the question from Romania, carbon capture and storage, where we already have blast furnaces. We can apply carbon capture and storage from cement. We can replace heavy fuel oil, marine oil, with either methanol or ammonia to drive the shipping fleets of the world. Now, in these sectors, unlike in EVs and solar plus batteries, at the moment, there is a green cost premium. And by the way, in these, there may be a green cost premium forever, right? And we need to accept that. We mustn't tell people that this transition is costless in the sectors where it may not be costless. But the great news is that the green cost premium, when you think not at the business-to-business level, but at the consumer level, turns out in most cases to be trivial. If we use methanol or ammonia to power ships, it is possible that that could produce a doubling of shipping freight rates. The impact of that on the cost of a pair of jeans made in Bangladesh and bought in London will be less than 1%. Less than 1%. And that is because global shipping in the arena of container ships is an unbelievably efficient, low-cost service. And indeed, global shipping rates regularly go up 4 times and come down 80% without anybody paying any attention to that or seeing, well, they pay attention if you're in the shipping industry, but at the consumer level, you just don't see the impact. And that means that as long as we can get policies that cover that green cost premium, then we will be able to head towards decarbonization, even if there's a cost. And that was why it was mentioned earlier, one of the most hopeful things that has happened this year was the IMO commitment to a global carbon price for shipping. And I mentioned earlier the disadvantages, the harm which the Trump presidency is doing to the fight against climate change. Well, they tried to do it at the IMO by having an empty seat strategy. They said, with an empty seat there, the rest of the world won't get on and agree with it. They also tried to tell all the major developing countries of the world to, oppose this nasty idea from the developed countries. But China, Brazil, and India all voted for the carbon levy because they care as much about climate change as we do, because they know how vulnerable they are to it. A huge step forward. So look, we are in a mess in terms of emissions. We have left the emission reductions too late, but we have the technologies that can get us there. What do we need to grab that opportunities? We need to have government policies. In the sectors where we are or soon can be at that tipping point, where the cost of the new technologies is lower than the old technologies. What you need is, you need initial subsidies to get us there, or you need regulations that speed the progress there, like the commitment in Europe to ban internal combustion engine sales from 2035, which, by the way, in the UK is 2030 and is going to have a major effect. We also need, in some of these, even where there is a potentially lower cost solution, to help people with the upfront costs of that. EVs are going to be cheaper than internal combustion engines upfront. Heat pumps are not going to be cheaper than gas boilers, right? They will be much cheaper to run, but they will have an investment cost up front, and lower income people will need help with that. So there's a whole set of government support we need, even in the sectors which are at the tipping point already. In the sectors where there is a green cost premium, and there may be for a long time, ultimately the best policy is carbon pricing. And we have got to take the European Emissions Trading Scheme and the CBAM, which is connected to it, and encourage other countries to introduce carbon pricing as well. And I'm actually quite hopeful. I'm hearing, as I travel the world, just last week in Southeast Asia, just before Christmas in China and in India as well, I am hearing more and more people in policy-making circles and in business saying, well, if Europe has an emissions trading scheme, a carbon price, and a CBAM against our carbon-intensive exports into Europe, we better have a serious carbon price at home. And I think we are going to see faster progress on that than many people realize. Finally, we need finance. I said that solar plus batteries is going to be the killer app of the energy transition, particularly in the Sunbelt countries in the world, particularly, let's say, in Africa. I think that in Africa, solar plus batteries could be a mechanism which means that Africa just never has to build any fossil fuel plants at all to drive a huge electricity system takeoff under one condition, which is that the cost of capital in Africa comes down. Because it's very simple. Because renewables are, the whole cost is up front, right? And then you enjoy zero marginal cost thereafter. The cost of capital, the rate of return that required, matters crucially. If the cost of capital in African countries was, let's say, 4 or 5% real that it is in Northern Europe, we would never see any fossil fuel electricity plants built in sub-Saharan Africa almost at all. You'd build renewables. If it's 10%, you build a gas turbine, and if it's 25%, as it is in many stressed countries, you build a diesel genset, which is, minimizing the upfront capital cost, but committing yourself to a dirty, expensive fuel. So we have got to, and this should be a key priority at COP30 in Belém, we have got to get serious about mobilizing the capital to the lower income countries, which enables them to seize an extraordinary technological opportunity, which wasn't there 10 years ago, but has arrived far faster than we thought. Finally, what does business need to do? Well, business needs to seize the many opportunities that come from these collapsing costs, but it also needs, and I was very interested how you ended that debate there, to think about what its responsibility is. I think Seb is quite right. You can't expect business to do all the heavy lifting if the policies aren't there. And we've seen this with one or two fossil fuel companies which went out on a limb, but have been crucified to the point that they might actually have been, takeover targets if they haven't changed tack. It's very difficult for an individual company to drive to net zero if there isn't the supporting environment, which says that actually the single most important thing that business does to drive to net zero is to argue for and to support the carbon pricing and regulation that will take you in that direction. And I think that is something which I would encourage people to do. But beyond that, there are lots of things that individual businesses can do. They can try and get their consumers to be willing to accept some small premium for products which are clean sourced, clean technology, clean carbon as well. And I can't imagine any better industry to do that than the fashion industry, which often has prices that look quite high relative to the basic cost of manufacture, because it's all in the brand value, the sales, the marketing, etc., in which case they have a greater opportunity than many other sectors of the economy to just add a teeny-weeny little bit to the price which they are charging to consumers, and to promise them that these products are made in a zero carbon and in all the other aspects of environmental sustainability. So, this is a challenging context in which to be starting London Climate Action Week, but I hope out of it we will all end up determined to seize the opportunities and to play our role into turning around this huge challenge. And I agree, I think it was Seb, you said this is one of the greatest challenges humanity has faced, but we do so with a set of technology trends providing a huge opportunity which we now have to seize. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Adair Turner. That was a very compelling, powerful speech with some important messages to various industries. And thank you to all of you for being here and for watching online. But that's not all from us this London Climate Action Week, because we'll be back here at High House tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. bright and early to examine the state of European climate leadership at what is a critical geopolitical juncture ahead of COP30. Do join us then. Bye-bye.